The dying light of Astaris cast long shadows across the desolate cityscape, where twisted metal spires reached toward a sky perpetually shrouded in industrial haze. 230 years had passed since the Great Collapse, and the once magnificent metropolis now stood as a monument to humanity's hubris. Broken windows stared like hollow eyes from skeletal buildings, while the silence was broken only by the occasional groan of settling debris and the whisper of wind through abandoned streets. Deep beneath this urban graveyard, in a network of tunnels that had once served as the city's subway system, a different kind of civilization had taken root. The underground research facility hummed with the soft glow of salvage technology, where teams of engineers and archaeologists worked tirelessly to piece together fragments of the lost world above. It was here, in this subterranean sanctuary, that Raffen Korin had made his life's work. At 28, Raffen possessed the lean build and calloused hands of someone who spent his days crawling through ruins and dismantling ancient machinery. His dark hair was perpetually dusted with concrete powder, and his green eyes held the focused intensity of a man obsessed with unlocking the secrets of the past. Unlike many of his colleagues who sought to understand the Great Collapse for purely academic reasons, Raffen was driven by a more personal ambition. He believed that somewhere in the rubble above lay the key to restoring humanity to its former glory, and he intended to be the one to find it. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Raffen emerged from the underground facility's airlocks, breathing apparatus secure over his nose and mouth as he stepped into the toxic atmosphere of the surface world. His destination was Sector 7, a relatively unexplored section of the old financial district, where seismic scans had detected anomalous energy signatures. The readings were faint but consistent, suggesting the presence of intact pre-collapse technology. As he picked his way through the rubble-strewn streets, Raffen's thoughts turned to his latest theory about the nature of the Great Collapse. The official records spoke of a catastrophic system failure that had brought down the city's power grid, causing widespread panic and the eventual abandonment of the surface. But Raffen suspected there was more to the story. The energy signatures he'd been tracking didn't match any known pre-collapse technology, and the patterns suggested something far more sophisticated than simple industrial equipment. The building he sought was a half-collapsed office tower, its lower floors buried under tons of debris from neighboring structures. Raffen had spent weeks carefully excavating a path to what had once been the building's basement levels, following his instruments deeper into the earth than any previous expedition had dared to go. The work was dangerous, the structure unstable, but the energy readings grew stronger with each meter of depth. As he descended into the makeshift tunnel he'd carved through the debris, Raffen's headlamp illuminated walls, lined with strange metalwork that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The architecture was unlike anything he'd seen in other ruins, more organic than mechanical, as if the building itself had been grown rather than constructed. His instruments were going haywire, displaying readings that should have been impossible according to everything he knew about pre-collapse technology. At the bottom of his excavation, behind a partially collapsed wall, Raffen's light fell upon something that made him catch his breath. Embedded in what appeared to be a crystalline matrix was the outline of a sword, its blade gleaming with an ethereal blue radiance that seemed to respond to his presence. Ancient symbols covered its surface, flowing script that seemed to shift and dance in the light of his headlamp. Raffen approached the weapon with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a priceless artifact. The sword was beautiful, in a way that transcended mere craftsmanship, its proportions perfect, its design somehow both elegant and menacing. As he reached out to touch the crystalline matrix that held it, the symbols on the blade flared brighter, and he felt a strange tingling sensation run up his arm. The extraction took 3 hours of careful work, using sonic tools to gradually weaken the crystal without damaging the sword itself. When the blade finally came free, Raffen was amazed by its weight, or rather, the lack thereof. Despite its size, the weapon felt almost weightless in his hands, as if it were made of solidified light rather than metal. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, the blade erupted in a cascade of pale fire that illuminated the entire chamber. Raffen stumbled backward, nearly dropping the sword in his shock. The light was not hot, as he had expected, but cool and soothing, like moonlight given substance. The ancient symbols along the blade were now clearly visible, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. As he stared at the weapon in wonder, he became aware of a low humming sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls around him. The return journey to the underground facility was fraught with anxiety. Raffen wrapped the sword in shock-absorbing foam and sealed it in a containment case designed for volatile artifacts. But even through the protective barriers, he could feel its presence like a living thing. The weapon seemed to be trying to communicate with him, filling his mind with half-formed images and sensations that he couldn't quite interpret. Back in his laboratory, Raffen set up a comprehensive analysis station, surrounding the sword with every scanning device at his disposal. The initial readings were beyond extraordinary, displaying energy levels that should have been impossible to contain in such a compact form. The blade appeared to be constructed of a material that existed in a state somewhere between matter and energy, its molecular structure shifting constantly in patterns too complex for his instruments to map. As he worked late into the night, inputting data and running calculations, Raffen became increasingly aware that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. The sword was not just a weapon, but a key, a focal point for energies that predated the Great Collapse by centuries, possibly millennia. The more he learned, the more he began to suspect that the weapon's discovery was not a coincidence, but the fulfillment of some ancient plan. It was during his third sleepless night of analysis that Raffen made his first critical error, attempting to activate what appeared to be a dormant scanning mode. He accidentally triggered a hidden mechanism within the sword's matrix. The weapon flared to life with unprecedented brightness, and the laboratory's security systems immediately went into lockdown, sealing all exits and triggering an emergency alert that echoed throughout the underground facility. Within minutes, Raffen found himself surrounded by members of the facility's security team. Their leader, a stern woman named Commander Torres, whose expression made it clear that she was not pleased with the night's developments. Behind her stood Dr. Marcus Webb, the facility's director, whose normally composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine concern as he stared at the still glowing sword. "Raffen," Dr. Webb said quietly, "I think you'd better explain exactly what you found." The debriefing lasted until dawn. Raffen presented his findings to the facility's senior staff, walking them through the discovery, the extraction, and the preliminary analysis. The energy readings alone were enough to cause a stir, but when he showed them the decoded fragments of the ancient script, the room fell into stunned silence. The symbols on the blade told a story that contradicted everything they thought they knew about pre-collapse civilization. According to the partial translation compiled by Dr. Sarah Kim, the facility's xenolinguist, the sword was something called the Dream Key, a weapon of transcendent power created by a civilization that had existed in parallel with the surface world. The underground kingdom had been vast, spanning continents, its people wielding technologies that blurred the line between science and magic. "This changes everything," Dr. Webb said as he studied the translation data. "If this civilization really existed, if they had this level of technology, then the Great Collapse might not have been an accident at all. The implications were staggering. If the underground kingdom had been real, and if they had possessed weapons like the Dream Key, then the official history of the Great Collapse was not just incomplete, but deliberately falsified. Someone had known about the underground civilization and had either destroyed it or driven it into hiding. The question was who, and whether they were still out there. Within hours of the briefing, Representatives from the Flamekeepers arrived at the facility. The Flamekeepers were the de facto government of the underground settlements, a technocratic organization that controlled access to technology and maintained order in the post-collapse world. Their arrival was not unexpected, but their demands were more aggressive than anyone had anticipated. "The weapon must be surrendered to proper authority," declared Councillor Helena Voss, the Flamekeepers' representative. She was a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question. "Artifacts of this power level cannot be left in the hands of individual researchers. The security of our people depends on centralized oversight of all potentially dangerous technology." Dr. Webb tried to negotiate, arguing that the sword required extensive study before it could be safely transferred. But Councillor Voss was unmoved. The Flamekeepers had come prepared with legal documents and a security detail, making it clear that cooperation was not optional. They gave the facility 24 hours to complete their preliminary analysis, after which the Dream Key would be relocated to the Flamekeepers' Central Research Complex. Raffin watched these proceedings with growing anger. He had risked his life to find the sword, had spent sleepless nights unlocking its secrets, and now it was to be taken away by bureaucrats who saw it only as a tool for maintaining their power. As the hours passed and the deadline approached, he found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. Late that night, as the facility settled into its quiet hours, Raffin made his way back to the laboratory where the Dream Key was being held under guard. He had spent years learning the security protocols, knew every camera placement and patrol route. Getting past the guards required all of his skills. But eventually, he stood alone before the containment case, the sword visible through its transparent walls like a trapped star. The moment his fingers touched the case's locking mechanism, alarms began to sound throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed everything in red as blast doors sealed the laboratory, trapping Raffin inside with the very weapon he had tried to steal. Through the reinforced windows, he could see security teams taking up positions, their weapons trained on the door. But something else was happening, something that none of them had anticipated. The Dream Key was responding to the proximity of danger, its light growing brighter and more intense with each passing second. The ancient symbols on its blade were now blazing like brands, and from somewhere deep beneath the facility came a rumbling that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Dr. Webb's voice came through the laboratory's intercom, tight with controlled panic. "Raffin, you need to step away from the containment case. The energy readings are off the charts. We're detecting massive power fluctuations throughout the entire underground complex." But Raffin couldn't step away. The sword was calling to him now, its voice clear and urgent in his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of the underground kingdom in its glory days, of vast caverns filled with crystal cities and people who wielded power like gods. He saw the moment of the kingdom's fall, betrayed from within, its people driven into an enchanted sleep that had lasted 2 centuries. "The warnings," he whispered, understanding flooding through him. "It's not just a weapon. It's a key to something that's been sleeping." The rumbling grew stronger, and cracks began to appear in the laboratory's walls. Through the facility's communication system, reports were coming in from throughout the underground complex. Ancient mechanisms were activating, systems that had been dormant since before the Great Collapse were coming online. And deep in the forgotten levels beneath the research facility, something was stirring. Councillor Voss burst into the control room, her composure finally cracking as she stared at the sensor displays. "What has he done? What is that artifact?" Dr. Webb was frantically trying to coordinate evacuation procedures while monitoring the continuing power surges. "It's not just the artifact," he said grimly. "There's something else down there. Something big. The seismic sensors are picking up movement in caverns we didn't even know existed." In the laboratory, Raffin made his decision. If the Flamekeepers wanted the Dream Key, They would have to come and take it. He shattered the containment case with a salvaged plasma cutter, and the moment his hand closed around the sword's hilt, the world exploded into light. The dream key sang in his grasp, its power flowing through him like liquid fire. He could feel the vast network of ancient tunnels and chambers that lay beneath the modern facility, could sense the sleeping mechanisms awakening after centuries of dormancy. But most of all, he could feel a presence, vast and patient, stirring in the deepest reaches of the underground realm. Security teams stormed the laboratory, but their weapons were useless against the barrier of light that surrounded Raffen. The dream key had transformed him into something more than human, a conduit for powers that belonged to an earlier age. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated through stone and steel. "You don't understand," he said to the assembled security forces. "This isn't just a weapon. It's a beacon. Someone has been waiting for it to be found." The tremors reached a crescendo, and suddenly the laboratory floor cracked open, revealing a shaft that descended into absolute darkness. From that darkness came a light that was not light, a radiance that existed beyond the visible spectrum, but could somehow be perceived nonetheless. And riding that impossible illumination, rising from depths that should not have existed, came a figure that made everyone in the room catch their breath. She was tall and regal, wrapped in robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. Her hair was silver white, her skin pale as porcelain, and her eyes held the weight of centuries. As she emerged from the shaft, floating rather than climbing, those ancient eyes fixed on Raffen with an expression of recognition and desperate need. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of ages, cutting through the chaos of alarms and shouted orders like a blade through silk. "Give it back," she said, extending one graceful hand toward the dream key. "Return what was taken, young keeper. The time of sleeping is ended." The security forces fell back, their weapons forgotten in the face of something that transcended their understanding. Even Counselor Voss stood speechless, her bureaucratic authority meaningless, before a presence that spoke of older, deeper powers. In the sudden silence, only Raffen found the courage to speak. "Who are you?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. The woman's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked less like a figure of legend, and more like someone who had carried a tremendous burden for far too long. "I am Celine," she said, "last Marshal of the Sunken Realm, guardian of the deep ways, and keeper of the sacred trust. I have slept for 200 years, waiting for the dream key to call me back to wakefulness. The time of restoration has come, but first, you must return what is mine." The words hit Raffen like a physical blow. This was the owner of the dream key, the one the ancient warnings had spoken of. Everything he had worked for, everything he had discovered, was about to slip away from him. But as he looked into Celine's ancient eyes, he realized that his personal ambitions were nothing compared to the forces now at work. "The kingdom," he said slowly. "The underground civilization. You're one of them." Celine nodded gravely. "The last of them. Perhaps. My people trusted unwisely, loved those who proved unworthy of love. The surface dwellers we sought to help turned against us, coveting our knowledge and power. In the end, we were forced to retreat into the deep places, to sleep and wait for a time when the world might be ready to accept what we could offer." Around them, the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. The facility's sensors were detecting massive energy buildups throughout the underground complex, and reports were coming in of similar disturbances in settlements across the continent. The awakening of the last Marshal had triggered something far larger than anyone had anticipated. Commander Torres stepped forward, her hand on her weapon, but her voice carefully controlled. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that this facility is under martial law. Whatever you are, whatever you represent, you'll need to submit to our authority while we sort this out." Celine turned toward the security commander, with an expression of mild curiosity, as if she were looking at an interesting but ultimately insignificant insect. "Your authority," she repeated, and there was something in her tone that made the air itself seem to grow colder. "Child, I ruled kingdoms when your ancestors were learning to make fire. I have slept through the rise and fall of your civilization, waiting for the moment when the dream key would call me back. Your authority means nothing to me." The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began to form on the walls. Some of the security personnel took involuntary steps backward, their training useless against a threat they couldn't understand or categorize. Only Raffin remained unmoved, the dream key's power protecting him from the sudden cold. "Wait," he said, stepping between Celine and the security forces. "There's been enough violence. Too much has been lost already." He looked at the sword in his hands, its light pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. "You say this belongs to you. Prove it." For a moment, the ancient woman looked surprised. Then, slowly, she began to smile. "You would test me, young keeper? You would demand proof from one who has slept for centuries?" Her eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Very well, but know that what you ask may cost more than you are prepared to pay." Celine raised her hand, and the air around her began to shimmer with power. When she spoke, her words were in the same ancient language that covered the dream key, and the sword responded to her voice like a tuning fork struck by a master musician. The blade's light intensified, and suddenly, Raffin could see everything, could understand the full scope of what was happening. The images flooded his mind. The underground kingdom in its glory, vast caverns filled with cities of crystal and light. He saw Celine as she had been 2 centuries ago, leading her people in a desperate war against enemies who had once been allies. He witnessed the betrayal that had brought the kingdom low, the treachery of surface dwellers who had been welcomed as friends, but who had coveted what they could never truly understand. He saw the final battle, fought in chambers deep beneath the earth, where Celine and the last of her warriors had made their stand against overwhelming odds. He saw her decision to enter the Great Sleep, using the dream key to bind herself and her surviving people in an enchanted slumber that would preserve them until the world was ready for their return. And finally, he saw the truth about the Great Collapse. It had not been an accident or a system failure, but a deliberate act of sabotage by those who feared the power of the underground kingdom. The surface dwellers had destroyed their own civilization rather than risk the return of the people they had betrayed. When the visions ended, Raffin found himself on his knees, tears streaming down his face. The weight of centuries of suffering and loss pressed down on him, but also something else: hope. The last marshal had awakened not for revenge, but for restoration. She sought not to punish the descendants of those who had wronged her people, but to heal the wounds that had festered for 200 years. "I understand," he whispered, extending the dream key toward Celine. "I understand why you had to sleep, and why you've awakened now. The world is broken, has been broken since the collapse. You want to fix it." Celine accepted the sword with the reverence due to a sacred relic, and the moment her fingers closed around its hilt, the entire facility was bathed in warm, golden light. The alarms fell silent, the emergency lights dimmed to normal levels, and the sense of impending catastrophe that had filled the air began to dissipate. "Not fix, young keeper," she said softly. "Heal. There is a difference. To fix something is to return it to its original state. To heal is to make it whole in a new way, stronger than it was before." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of the security personnel, the scientists, the representatives of the Flamekeepers. "Your people have lived in fear for too long, hiding underground, fighting over scraps of the past. The time has come to reclaim the surface, to build something new from the ashes of what was lost." Counselor Voss stepped forward, her political instincts finally overcoming her shock. "That's all very poetic," she said carefully. "But the reality is that we have established systems, established authority. Any major changes would need to be approved through proper channels, subjected to review by qualified experts." Celine's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped several more degrees. "Proper channels," she repeated. "Qualified experts." She turned to Raffin. "Young keeper, tell me truly, have your proper channels and qualified experts brought your people prosperity? Have they restored the surface world? Have they ended the suffering that has plagued humanity since the collapse?" Raffin met her gaze steadily. "No," he said. "They've maintained order, kept people alive, but they haven't solved anything. We're still hiding, still afraid, still living off the scraps of a dead civilization." "Then perhaps," Celine said, turning back to Councillor Voss, "it is time to try a different approach." What followed was unlike any negotiation in recorded history. Celine spoke of technologies that could purify the poisoned atmosphere, of energy sources that could power a new golden age, of knowledge that could heal not just the physical wounds left by the collapse, but the spiritual ones as well. The representatives of the Flamekeepers listened with growing amazement and growing concern, for they realized that everything she offered came with a price: the end of their monopoly on power. The discussions continued for hours, sometimes heated, sometimes philosophical, always conducted against the backdrop of the changes that were already occurring throughout the underground complex. Ancient systems were coming online. Mechanisms that had slept for centuries were awakening, and deep in the forgotten levels. Celine's people were stirring from their long sleep. It was Dr. Webb who finally asked the question that everyone was thinking. "The others," he said. "Your people who entered the Great Sleep with you, how many are there?" Celine's expression grew sad. "Fewer than there were," she admitted. "The sleep was not kind to all who entered it. Many chose to pass into true death rather than endure the dreams of what was lost. But those who remain, perhaps 1,000 souls, are the keepers of knowledge that your world desperately needs. 1,000 people with the knowledge and power of the underground kingdom." The implications were staggering, not just for the underground settlements, but for the entire world. If Celine was telling the truth, if her people really possessed the technologies she claimed, then humanity's long exile from the surface was about to end. But not everyone was pleased with this prospect. As word of the awakening spread through the communication networks that connected the various underground settlements, reactions ranged from excitement to terror. Some saw it as the dawn of a new age, while others viewed it as a threat to everything they had built in the post-collapse world. The first armed response came within 6 hours. A coalition of settlements that had rejected the Flamekeepers' authority dispatched military units to secure the research facility, claiming that the awakening represented an existential threat to human independence. They arrived to find the facility's defenses mysteriously enhanced, protected by shields of crystalline energy that turned aside their most powerful weapons. Celine met their leaders in the facility's main conference room, still wearing her robes of starlight, the dream key at her side radiating calm authority. "You fear us," she said without preamble. "You believe that our awakening means your enslavement. This is understandable, given what your histories have taught you about power and those who wield it." General Morrison, the coalition's military commander, was a grizzled veteran whose career had been built on maintaining the delicate balance between the various underground factions. He studied Celine with the eye of a man who had seen too many would-be conquerors to be impressed by displays of supernatural power. "What we fear," he said bluntly, "is the unknown. You claim to offer salvation, but history is full of saviors who turned out to be tyrants. How do we know you're different?" Celine nodded approvingly. "A fair question, and one that deserves an honest answer. You know us only through legend and fear, through stories passed down by those who had reasons to paint us as monsters. Allow me to show you the truth. What she showed them was not conquest, but cooperation. Through the Dream Key's power, she projected images of the underground kingdom's true history, revealing not the dark empire of legend, but a civilization built on principles of harmony and mutual aid. Her people had been teachers and healers, sharing their knowledge freely with any who asked for it. The betrayal, when it came, had been motivated not by fear of tyranny, but by simple greed. A faction of surface dwellers had wanted to claim the underground kingdom's power for themselves, to rule rather than serve. When they were refused, they had chosen to destroy what they could not possess. "We made mistakes," Celine admitted as the visions faded. "We trusted too easily, loved too completely. We believed that all people shared our desire for harmony and growth. The pain of betrayal drove us into the deep sleep, but it also taught us wisdom. We will not make the same errors again." The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes contentious, but slowly, carefully, the framework for a new world began to take shape. Celine's people would not rule from above, but would work alongside humanity's existing leadership, sharing their knowledge gradually, and only with those who demonstrated the wisdom to use it responsibly. Raffin found himself at the center of these discussions, his role evolving from that of discoverer to interpreter, helping bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern necessity. The Dream Key had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand, giving him insights into both civilizations that made him uniquely qualified to facilitate their merger. The work was not easy. Centuries of mistrust could not be overcome in days or even weeks. There were those on both sides who preferred the certainty of separation to the risks of cooperation. But gradually, as Celine's people emerged from their long sleep and began to demonstrate the reality of what they offered, opposition began to give way to cautious hope. The first major test came when a massive storm system, born of the atmospheric chaos that had plagued the surface since the collapse, threatened to devastate what remained of the eastern seaboard. Traditional shelters would not be sufficient, and evacuation was impossible on the scale required. It was then that Celine made her first public demonstration of the power her people commanded. Standing on the surface for the first time in 2 centuries, surrounded by representatives of every major settlement, and broadcast to millions more through salvage communication networks, she raised the Dream Key toward the roiling clouds. Ancient words of power rolled from her lips, and the sword blazed with light that could be seen for hundreds of miles. The storm began to dissipate, its chaotic energies channeled and redirected, its destructive potential transformed into gentle rain that fell on ground that had been parched for decades. Where the water touched the poisoned earth, green things began to grow, the first natural vegetation many had seen in their entire lives. The demonstration was more than just a display of power. It was a promise of what could be accomplished when ancient wisdom and modern determination worked together. Over the following months, as more of Celine's people awakened and began to share their knowledge, the pace of change accelerated. Air purification systems based on crystalline matrices began clearing the atmosphere above major population centers. Energy sources that drew power from the Earth itself started replacing the dangerous and inefficient fusion reactors that had powered the underground settlements. Most importantly, the barriers between surface and underground began to dissolve as people rediscovered the confidence to reclaim their world. Raffin watched these transformations with a mixture of pride and humility. He had set out to find artifacts that would restore humanity's glory, and in a way, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But the glory that was emerging was not a return to the past, but the birth of something entirely new, a synthesis of human ambition and ancient wisdom that promised to surpass anything that had come before. The Dream Key remained with Celine, but its power had touched him permanently, giving him abilities and insights that he was still learning to master. He found himself able to understand the harmonic frequencies that controlled the ancient technologies, to perceive the energy flows that connected all living things, to serve as a bridge between worlds that had been separated for too long. As the first anniversary of the awakening approached, Raffin stood once again on the surface of Astaris. But the city he looked upon bore little resemblance to the ruin he had explored a year before. Crystal spires rose alongside restored skyscrapers, their faceted surfaces catching and redirecting sunlight into patterns of breathtaking beauty. The air was clean enough to breathe without protection, and the streets, that had been choked with debris, now hosted markets and festivals where the descendants of both civilizations mingled freely. Celine joined him on the observation platform, the Dream Key's gentle radiance a constant presence at her side. The centuries of sleep had not aged her, but the year of awakening had brought changes to her features, a softening that spoke of burdens shared rather than carried alone. "Do you regret it?" she asked, following his gaze across the transformed cityscape. "The life you gave up to find me, the simpler world you left behind?" Raffin considered the question seriously. His old life seemed like a dream now, his former ambitions petty and self-serving compared to what had been accomplished. The world was no longer broken, no longer trapped in the shadows of its former glory. But more than that, humanity was no longer alone, no longer forced to struggle through its darkest hours without hope of redemption. "No," he said finally. "I thought I was looking for the past, but what I found was the future. What we found was the future." Celine nodded, her ancient eyes reflecting the light of the setting sun. "The cycle turns," she said softly. "From destruction comes creation. From ending comes beginning. The Dream Key has served its purpose, awakening not just my people but something in yours as well. The age of hiding is over. The age of growth has begun." Below them, the city hummed with life and purpose, the sound of a civilization reborn. And in the depths of the earth, in chambers that had once held only sleeping figures and fading dreams, new songs were being born, melodies that would guide humanity and its ancient allies into whatever wonders the future might hold. The sword that had slept for 2 centuries had awakened more than just its owner. It had awakened hope itself, and in doing so, had fulfilled the greatest magic of all, the transformation of ending into beginning, of despair into joy, of solitude into the recognition that no one, no matter how lost they might seem, ever truly walks alone. Years would pass, and the story of the Dream Key would be told and retold, becoming legend in its own right. But those who lived through the awakening would always remember the moment when the impossible became inevitable, when a young engineer's curiosity unleashed forces that changed the world forever. They would remember that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from seeking power or glory, but from the simple willingness to return what belongs to another, to serve something greater than oneself. And in the heart of the renewed world, in a place of honor, within the crystal palace that had grown from the ruins of the old research facility, the Dream Key rested at last, its long vigil ended, its purpose fulfilled. The age of sleeping was over. The age of dreams made manifest had begun.